Thanks for staying with us on the conversation. On the first half, we dealt with the swearing-in ceremony of the new president of Nigeria, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, and we're discussing the expectations and prospect for his administration that his gig starts today. Moving on to our next story, we have the African Union warning against turning Africa into a geopolitical battleground for global powers, urging the continent to focus on its own peace and security. The AU Commission Chief Musa Fakhi Mahamat emphasized the risk of a new Cold War emerging in Africa due to competing political interests. Alongside this, the AU promoted the African Continental Free Trade Area AfCFTA on Africa Day, highlighting its potential to boost job creation, poverty alleviation, and sustainable development.
Now, the World Bank estimates that full implementation of the AfCFTA could result in real income gains of around $450 billion by 2035. Africa Day serves as a platform to raise awareness of Pan-African ideals and educate about the continent's history, with a focus this year on shaping a positive future. Now, joining us live from Kampala, Uganda, is Simon Sinyonga. He's a lawyer and is a legal practitioner and joins from Uganda. We also have Alistair Wilcox, a political analyst who joins us from Lagos, Nigeria. One welcome to you, gentlemen, and thanks for joining us on the conversation. I'd like to start with you, Alistair. Could you provide an analysis of the current geopolitical landscape in Nigeria? How have the recent conflicts and power struggles among global powers impacted our continent?
Well, the world is a global village, and as such, there is no room for sitting on the fence with respect to nations aligning with either their colonial masters or other world interests, because Africa is seen as a place where they need aid and they need a lot of resources. So the richer nations will always want to use Africa as pawn in their quest for their territorial expansion and their territorial interests. However, bigger countries like Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, and some other countries can withstand their own ground. For instance, Nigeria has never found itself aligning with any power. They've decided to maintain a neutrality, not because they don't, not that they don't have sympathy for any of the fact of the parts, but because of our own peculiarity in Nigeria, vis-a-vis our religion differences, our tribal differences, and some other differences, the government has always tried to bring these things to bear in not openly aligning to any part. But that is Nigeria being a big country. But how many smaller countries will be able to withstand pressure from all these world powers that are looking for influence and looking for support? I know for sure that African countries, in world geopolitical politics, African countries are key because they will always want who they can. The world powers will always want as much help and as much influence as they can bear, and to get these African countries to support their position. So that's the way where Africa finds itself. This call is coming a rather late because a lot of interest has already taken place in Africa, and it may be a wake-up call that African nations need to reassess their geopolitical leaning and be able to stand their own and be able to maintain their neutrality.
But do you think we're in a position to do that, knowing that a lot of African countries are aid dependent? There's a saying by former president of Burkina Faso, Thomas Sankara. He says, "He who feeds you controls you."
Yes, that's what I'm saying. For some richer countries, stronger countries like Nigeria, yes, they can withstand. But there are so many other countries that cannot be able to withstand the pressure. Moreover, when there is threats, when there is sanctions being looming on to again, African leaders are so corrupt that they always fall prey to international law and practices, and so there will always be the need to bring some international dimension to their corrupt activities as a kind of intimidation against them, and so they will just fall like a pack of cards. The richer countries, bigger countries might be able to withstand. Nigeria, being one, has been able to withstand some of these pressures, even though they might secretly support a particular move, but they will not come openly to express it. But that cannot be said of. Remember during the Gulf War, when the US was looking for support from all countries, some countries just send as little as 20 troops, 20 soldiers, and they are counted as part of the coalition forces. So it's a war politics. And like you say, he who feeds you controls you. And until African leaders begin to stand on their own and feed themselves and remain focused to their calling and commit to their people and be less corrupt, this kind of pressure will always come to them to support one cause or the other.
All right, thank you so much, Alessa. I'd like to bring in Simon into this conversation. And we're seeing situations where the African Union is saying, you know what, let's focus on our own issues and let's not make Africa a battleground. And looking at the issues, we're seeing major issues in Sudan, and we're seeing in Mali military coups going on. And there are also talks about the fact that these global powers are exacerbating the conflict that we're seeing in Africa. So for you, what influence have major global powers had in exacerbating or increasing the conflict and the crisis we're seeing in Africa?
Thank you. I think the first thing is that the conversation right now is taking shape because there is some form of physical war, military war. But you see, the test of our integrity and sovereignty as African people was majorly tested at the time where there was medical tyranny. Remember the past 2 years, 2020 to 2022, where there were the global lockdowns. That's the first time where our sovereignty was tested, because we chose to align ourselves, especially to untested global tendencies, such as the global lockdowns. Remember the medical tyranny of the manipulative vaccination programs, among other things. So for me, the performance of the African people cannot only be questioned when there is military war, but you have to put into account the choices we have made previously to align ourselves to medical tendencies or global practices, which ideally do not favor us as an African people. Number two, the need to redefine what regional integration means for us as a people. Does it mean just making blocks, continental blocks or regional blocks that favor certain international alliances, or actually the African Union and the continental blocks are actually designed to redefine and awaken our image as an African people? So the extent of the global influence onto the African people has been made, number one, because of our failure to have a strong stand in the times where it mattered most and it counted most. And I've showed you, for example, the past 2 years. But also, secondly, you look at, take a reading, for example, Article 9 of the instrument that creates the African Union. It creates 9 organs that are supposed to make sure that the African Union is running in a specific and unique way. But you ask yourself, of all those organs, how many of them are actually able to defend, say, the sovereignty of Africa? Just take one example, the African Standby Force that was selected. In the time of war, for example, how many of the countries are fulfilling their pledges and commitments towards the support of the African Standby Force? Now, in the absence of those, you don't in any way expect that the African nations can maintain their sovereignty. Now, again, I'll just finalize with this one point to that question. I think last week we were discussing the question of food security, for example, in Africa, where you have about 2-3 nations which are fully depending on wheat exported from other nations, and there is no alternative for a secure food production in the context of wheat, for example, in some nations. So in the absence of functional systems, in the absence of a sure image of who we are as an African people, definitely the globalist agenda will take shape to cause us to play by their cards in the geopolitics.
Thank you, Simon. Now, Alesta, in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, The United States ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, said African countries that voted to that abstained from the vote suggested they had picked a side in Russia, and that you can be neutral in this sort of affairs, that it's black and white. And in that statement, she tried to say that, you know, you don't have the agency to decide as a sovereign nation what side you should take. Now, Lester, what steps can African nations take to safeguard their sovereignty and prevent themselves from being manipulated or exploited in the midst of global power struggles?
Well, so long as you continue to be a dependent child, then he who plays the piper will always dictate the tune. Unfortunately, Africans have continually seen themselves as no-do-well, underdogs, and refuse to chart an African course for themselves. Maybe it's getting too late by the day, because as at the time African leaders were supposed to have laid the foundation, when the world has not gone this global, this full 360-degree global, technology has come in to put a lot of spanner in the works. Africans have, if before now they had sat down to do a proper internal mechanism through the AU, through the OAU first, then through the AU, to have a united front for Africa and to develop Africa based on their own terms and conditions, and not dance to the dictates of the West in terms of aid, loans, and not be too corrupt against their people, but serve their people rightly, just as some great African leaders had done, like Mama Gaddafi. I'm not his fan, but I know that he did quite a lot for his people. People like Thomas Sankara, for the few years he held sway. People like Julius Nyerere. I mean, I can mention a few of them that really have that focus for Africa and for their country. And if they had done that internal foundation then, and placed their countries, in fact, and make Africa like the way Europe like the way Europe sees Europeans, and made all the Europeans to be one, and made Africa like that, I think now Africa will not be doing a catch-up, because the developmental stride of Africa will have grown to the point of making Africa a voice that will be respected. But unfortunately, no. Successive leadership and administration in Africa has remained corrupt, extremely corrupt, and depend on the West either to hide their loot or to help them to be more corrupt in terms of the kind of policy that they. So already your blueprint is in the West, and they all have this. So at this point, you don't have any, because even right now, the war has gone 360 degrees roundabout in terms of technology and development. So, and you are still doing a catch-up. So when will you now grow to now start learning this power? They give you the aids, they determine your government, they pull the strings when you are not dancing to their tune. So it still depends on African leaders to come together again, and to maybe the new breed of African leaders, and to say, look, we can't continue like this.
Definitely.
Something needs to give way. And if it means we have to starve, and they carry their people along, if it means we have to starve for a few years to get back our independence, to get back our mouth, and of course it takes a lot, because if you want to eat omelette, we must try to break the egg, you know. So if you don't want to break the egg, they cannot eat this omelette. So it takes a lot of internal restructuring in the minds of leaders, then cascade down to their followers, because today everybody
definitely a lot of proverbs there, a lot of interventions that are needed. I would like to bring in time, because we're running far out of time. We're looking about interventions, regional interventions, continental interventions that can make Africa more sovereign. And you would say that one of the things that Africa needs is to be economically independent. That's what Alessa was talking about. I mean, if a country, the global powers are still feeding you, then how can you stand on your own? How can you be sovereign? We've seen the African Continental Free Trade Area. It's been hailed as a catalyst for prosperity and development. Aside this, what other continental or regional interventions is needed to, improve on the region or the continent's sovereignty?
Number one, I would just like to refer you to some. I think in 2017, President Paul Kagame of Rwanda authored a very interesting document that offered alternatives, for example, on how the African Union needed to operate. One of the very interesting things that he mentions in that document, one of the recommendations is that, number one, make regional integration blocks relatable to the common man. Because you see, the debate of African sovereignty has only been left for the so-called politicians, and it's a high-level discussion. So it's not something that the common man would love to associate with. Number two, we need to rethink our policy strategy to avoid transferring the development burden to other so-called big economies from the West. We need, as Kwame Nkrumah said, we need to have African solutions for African problems, not just getting, a one-size-fits-all solution that comes from whether Russia or China or UK or USA to be implemented within the African context. There needs to be a deliberate capacity development of us as an African people to own the cause. And the only way you're going to do that is making the common man interested in the matters that matter for them. So this conversation needs to not to be just high level, but needs to be disintegrated down to the most common man, and even responsibility decentralized. I think one of the suggestions he gives in that document, it's a 2017 document by Paul Kagame, he says that, for example, develop African corps that can popularize the African culture and the African sports, because then there is a sense of ownership, there is a sense of participation within the African continent. Now, the other thing I think should be very, very important is the redefinition of our image as a people. So for so long, we have thought that the West has our best interests at heart, and therefore what we do is that we only parrot their standards. So we think their democracy is the best, we think their economic policies are the best, but look here, economically the Silicon Bank has just collapsed, which they thought was actually a force to reckon with to help the young people in the USA. Think about it this way, the USA democracy is struggling, and it was indicted, for example, in 2017 with the election between Donald Trump and, for example, Joe Biden. So for me, we need to take off the whole clock of thinking that we need to have the one-size-fits-all standard.
Definitely. A whole lot of restructuring is needed, Simon. We could go on and on this conversation. We will continue to discuss about this, how Africa can be more sovereign. But thank you so much, Simon Sayanga, for joining us in this conversation. Also, Alessia Wilcox for joining us in this conversation.
Thank you, gentlemen.